Hello, I'm Frank Kupsidis. I am the founder and president of the LPTV Broadcasters Association, and am thrilled to have the guru of rules and regulations, the man himself, Mr. David Oxenford, with us today to discuss rules and regulations and life with the FCC and what surprises might be in store.
Wow,
how does that sound?
That sounds exciting, Frank. Hopefully I've got some surprises for you.
So tell us first, you put out a weekly blog for the industry. When did you start doing it? What motivated you? And what do you find are the most frequently asked questions?
Sure. Well, the blog has actually been going since 2006. So we're, 17 years old now. And it does come out more than weekly, especially when I've got the opportunity to write on more things. We certainly put out a weekly update on just what happened in the previous week, but then write more extensive articles on lots of things when they come out. What's the most frequent question? You know, people love to read about rule violations and what other people are getting in trouble for to make sure that they don't have problems. But we also get a lot of readers looking at things like music licensing issues, copyright issues, and other, more industry-wide developments than just the plain fines. But fines are a hot topic.
And interestingly enough, we had a question this week from an LPTV broadcaster who said, well, I don't play music and BMI is after me. Why do I need a BMI license?
Sure. I can't believe that there is a TV broadcaster, or I find it hard to believe that there's a TV broadcaster who doesn't play any music and doesn't have any need for a music license, because commercials all have music. And most of those commercials don't have music that's been cleared by the producer of the commercial. So when you're playing a Ford truck ad that has John Mellencamp in the background, that's a performance of a John Mellencamp song, and he gets a royalty off of that. Everybody who writes jingles and intros to TV programs gets a royalty off of that. Even jingle packages that you buy from jingle package suppliers are copyrighted material, and they get royalties. So ASCAP, BMI, CSAC, and now GMR are all out there looking for royalties.
And to be clear, that's not for performance. That's just for the writers of the music.
Right. It's for the performance of the compositions of the music. Those folks who wrote the lyrics or the underlying notes of the song, they're the ones who get paid when it's performed on an over-the-air broadcast station, whether that's radio or TV.
Right. And I think it's interesting to note that the US is one of the few countries in the world that doesn't have performance royalties. In other words, performance insofar as the performer is paid as well.
That's correct. In the US, it's only in the digital world where you have to pay the performance royalty to the artist or the record label that owns the sound recording copyright.
So you need a license from all four, correct? All four PRO.
Correct. Probably, GMR is newer, but they do have lots of artists that are used in lots of commercials, lots of programs. So yeah, it's probably worth getting a GMR license. Also, I think it's important to note for any TV broadcaster, even though there's not a performance royalty on the recording for a particular artist, be careful how you use it. If you start to produce programs using sound recordings by particular artists and synchronize those with video, especially when you use it as a rerun or when you put it on your website, that needs what's called a sync license or a master use license, where you have to go to the artist and get permission to use that song. And there have been TV stations that have been burned, one just in the last couple of months for using music from a particular band or singer without getting the rights to do that and putting it on their website or otherwise repurposing it.
But you are allowed to use songs as bumpers, say, for a newscast. to go in and out of commercials, correct?
As long as it's not recorded in a particular place, it's not a standard logo or intro that you would use every time you introduce a particular program. There you might have some problems, but if you're just using some music as a bumper or transition music between programs and it's not the same music all the time, that's covered by your ASCAP, BMI, CSAC, and GMR license, and doesn't need this master use or sync license.
And what would happen? What are the fines, penalties if they catch you?
$150,000 per copyrighted work that can be the extent of the liability if you use it knowingly. Practically speaking, they're probably going to settle for a lot less than that because the fines can vary anywhere between $750,000 and $150,000. But the demand letter you're going to get is you owe me $150,000, pay up, then you got to negotiate.
Right. Wow, that's worse than the FCC.
It is indeed.
So let's go to reports. We could do a whole segment just on music and probably should at some point because there's so many questions that come up. Maybe one last one on music, and that is if you record a live performance, you have somebody on your show. How often can you show that performance again?
Maybe we should defer that to the music conversation because that's a nuanced
It's a complicated question. Right?
Yeah, certainly you can play it once because you've got a right to do it. Possibly you can play it again within a reasonably short period of time, but certainly you can't rerun it more than 6 months away because what's called the ephemeral exception in a certain section of the Copyright Act says that you can keep these ephemeral copies where you have transitory copies just to facilitate a broadcast for no more than 6 months. So if you put it for more than 6 months, or you export it to a different station, or you put it on your website, then you've got to get the rights cleared up from both the songwriters and the performers of the music. As Frank runs away from me.
I'm running away because my phone won't stop ringing and I had to disconnect it. Nothing like live Zoom.
There you go. Professional. We're all professional.
All professionals. We're not even going to edit this out. Right. This is reality. Reality Zoom.
There you go.
So insofar as rules, what is the number one rule that people violate all the time and get fines for?
Wow. There are so many different rules that can trip you up. Let's run through a couple of ones that are a concern all the time. Sponsorship identification is one of the ones that everybody should be looking at. When you get paid or get anything of value to say something on the air, do a sponsorship identification. Or even if you're getting free tickets to a concert in your area, or a free video to run it on the air to promote, RV, a model of an RV or a model of a car or something like that. Say that you got the video. Say that you got the tickets in exchange for giving them away on the air, so that your users, your listeners, know that that you've got something for free. In order to say something on the air. And certainly if you get paid to do any sort of program, identify the sponsor. Even if you're doing a half-hour real estate program where the real estate broker is doing a gallery of homes, make sure it's paid for by XYZ real estate company. If you do a morning program where you feature a different business every day in your market or once a week in your market, identify that sponsor paid for that program. We had a radio station 7 or 8 years ago that a client wanted to buy, and the deal got all hung up because there was a complaint. They were doing that kind of program and had not identified The following half hour was paid for by the hardware store on Main Street. The following half hour was paid for by Joe's Bar and Grill on 2nd Avenue. All they said was the following is a paid program. They said that, but that was not enough for the FCC because it didn't say who had actually paid for that program. So you got to make sure that you pay for you identify the actual sponsor of a program.
And now with foreign ownership, where does that stand?
Yeah, for foreign ownership, every time you sell a block of time, you've got to do some investigation. First, by getting a declaration from whoever buys that block of time that they're not a representative of a foreign government. And second, you've got to make sure that they're telling you the truth by looking in the Foreign Agents Registration Act database in the Department of Justice website to make sure that that company or individual who bought that block of time on your station is not a representative of a foreign government. And that's crazy. You know, you sell a church service on Sunday morning for an hour. You got to make sure the church is not a representative of the Russians or the Chinese, which is what this was really intended to prohibit. Or not prohibit, intended to identify was programming from governments that might have reasons to put out propaganda, but it requires that all broadcasters do some investigation to make sure that any block of program, anything other than just spot advertising time, is not being sponsored by a foreign government, and keep records to show that you've done that investigation.
Right. So even if you're showing the BBC's news for a half hour in the evening,
if they paid you to run that, if you got consideration to run that program, that's correct.
And if you didn't?
That's one you should talk to your attorney about, because there is an argument that if they're giving you the program for free and it was paid for by a foreign government, just getting the program itself requires that there be a enhanced sponsorship identification at the beginning of the program saying it's a program that's paid for by a representative or provided by a representative of a foreign government.
Right. That's an interesting one that I know has a ways to go. Ownership reports.
Yeah, that's another issue that we've had lots of problems with, and we're getting lots of follow-up too from the FCC, which we've never gotten before. Every other year, all broadcasters, including LPTV operators, need to file a biennial ownership report listing all of the attributable owners of the station. And that's for purposes of the FCC figuring out who the owners are of all the broadcast stations and assessing their gender and whether they're members of racial or ethnic minority groups. But the FCC has really been cracking down on that because they've gotten some heat from various courts for not taking the obligation seriously to figure out who owns broadcast stations and figure out what race and gender the owners are for assessing the success of EEO programs, for instance. And so the FCC now is looking at biennial ownership reports, following up to make sure that they were properly filled out and provided the right information. And I think a lot of low power TVs didn't bother to file back in December when they were due. They'll be due again in December of 2023. So be ready to file them again next year. I expect that sooner or later, the FCC will start fining stations that didn't file on time. We've already seen a couple of reminders about people who didn't file in December, get them on file by March 1. Hopefully people followed up on that, because I wouldn't be surprised to see some fines for people who didn't.
And how about EAS, another area, right?
EAS is another area. Every year, the FCC does a nationwide EAS test. And after those EAS tests, you have to file reports. with the FCC as to whether or not your station received and rebroadcast the test. It doesn't make any difference if you didn't get it because there's a failure of the network to pass down that alert to your station. You know, the FCC wants to know that, but you have to file those reports. And in the assessment that the FCC did of the tests that they did last summer, it was LPTV operators who were the worst offenders in not filing those reports. About a third of LPTV operators didn't file those reports. And again, the FCC reminded people on that. There'll likely be another test this summer. And I think we're going to see some fines for people who don't file those reports, because there was some language in the report that came out after this year's test talking about we're going to be looking at stricter enforcement for people who don't file in the future to make sure that these things come through.
So what advice do you have for the person who hasn't filed their ownership report, who didn't file their EAS reports, they're behind in reports, and now they're scared to file because they haven't filed?
I actually think it's better to file now rather than wait to get caught. Because if you file and somebody comes to you and says you filed late, yeah, you may get a fine. More likely you'll get a don't do that again, nastygram from the FCC, a letter. But if you wait for the FCC to discover that you didn't do something, that's when you're more likely to see a fine.
Got it. And EEO?
Yeah, you know, EEO is another area that LPTV sometimes don't think about. But if you've got 5 or more full-time employees, full-time being 30 hours per week at your station, you've got to do EEO recruiting when you've got job openings, and you've got to prepare annual EEO reports. And you don't have a public file to upload them to, but if there's ever a complaint about your EEO compliance, you'd probably have to show those reports. And if you're a Class A low power TV station or a Class A TV station, formerly a low power, you do have a public file and you do have to upload those annual EEO reports and you know, other obligations of full power broadcasters. In fact, if you're a Class A, you've got things like political broadcasting documentation that's got to be regularly upgraded, quarterly issues programs lists that's got to be regularly uploaded. So you've got to keep on top of all the obligations that apply to a full power TV station if you're a Class A, and put those in those online public files. And that's one area where the FCC has been very strict in finding people. If you are a Class A and you don't keep up your public inspection file, the TV branch has been starting to issue fines, $3,000 here, $6,000 here, $10,000 here for stations that have really dropped the ball on doing some online public file stuff, even Class A's.
Huh.
In fact, most of the early renewal fines have been Class A TV stations, not full powers from the TV branch.
Interesting, interesting. So what advice would you have overall for an LPTV station to follow the rules?
Follow the rules. That's certainly my advice. It's to pay attention. You know, read the trade press, read things like my blog. Lots of other law firms put out blogs of their own. Join your state broadcast association, who's regularly putting out newsletters or updates on regulatory obligations. Check the FCC website on a regular basis, because they're always putting out notices on what needs to be done. Stay on top of those regulatory obligations, because you don't want to get caught violating the rules, because again, fines are going to be $3,000, $6,000, $10,000, could be $15,000 if you've totally messed up on keeping compliance with your FCC regulations. And certainly technical obligations is another area where you're going to get hit with fines, and even bigger fines. Things like tower lighting. If you've got your own tower, make sure your tower lights are lit. That's a huge area of potential liability, because the FCC doesn't want airplanes flying into towers. And if you don't keep up the lights, that's a problem. reporting whether you've been off the air. We've seen numbers of fines for stations. If you're off the air for more than 10 days, you've got to tell the FCC. If you're off the air for more than 30 days or operating at reduced power, you've got to ask for special temporary authority. And we've seen lots of fines. That's a great place for some competitor who doesn't like you to catch you and cause a fine. Hey, this guy's been off the air for 6 months and he's never filed anything at the FCC. The FCC's got almost no excuse except to issue a fine for that sort of thing. And we just saw one of those for, I think, an LPFM in the last week or so. So yes, the FCC does issue fines for that sort of thing.
Wow. Well, we're going to need to revisit music at some point. And I want to thank you for joining us today for this. My last question for you.
Sure.
What is your favorite sleeper film?
My favorite sleeper film?
Right.
Wow. Local Hero.
Tell us about it.
Local Hero. It's a movie set in Scotland that stars Burt Lancaster and Peter Rieger. Peter Rieger works for an oil company. Burt Lancaster is this eccentric, or is his boss, and they're trying to buy a beach in Scotland to be a oil dock to bring in North Sea oil. And there's an eccentric guy living on the beach who doesn't want to sell it. It's a great, quirky, bizarre movie worth watching.
Fun. Thank you, David. Have a great day, and we appreciate your being with us.
Happy to do it, Frank. Look forward to seeing you at the NAB convention.
Absolutely. Take care.
Bye-bye.